Hello everyone again, and I guess we're spending more time in the Drydock than a Napoleonic-era French fleet. But with that said, there's plenty more questions to get to, and we're not going to get through all of them again, but maybe we'll make a dent in this little inbox tray of mine. Let's go. So last week we discussed the possibility of talking about alternate histories and what-ifs. And taking into account both the feedback from various subscribers plus the number of people who have posited a bunch of questions, I've decided the best compromise is probably going to be doing the occasional sort of alternate history what if special video. So everything will be concentrated in those. I'll tag them. They'll probably run on for quite a bit like a miniature Drydock episode. Maybe get through 2 or 3 possible scenarios, and then if you don't like alternate history, you don't have to watch it. It won't impinge on the main content of the channel, but if you do want to hear my thoughts and ramblings on possible alternate ways things could have gone down, well, there you go. Baza asks, given your knowledge of previous naval trends, in your opinion, how do you see the future of navies? Well, it's an interesting one, isn't it? At the moment, you essentially, outside of a few specialised niches, have 3 main arms of navies these days. You have carriers, you have other surface combatants, and you have submarines. Now, a carrier is a carrier is a carrier. Size and shape may change somewhat, but effectively they're big floaty boxes with aircraft in them. Now, I don't see that changing all that much. You can't really stealth a carrier that much just because of the big flat surface on the top. But what I could see happening is future carriers possibly are going more down the route of the recent British Queen Elizabeth class with split islands, which is a feature that hasn't been seen for quite a while, since about the 1920s and 1930s. And that basically comes down to the reason the Queen Elizabeth class carriers have them is because it's much easier to steer a ship from further forward, but much easier to command an air group from further back, and carriers are getting to the kind of size where you can't just have an extremely long island. You'll notice on the latest American Ford class carriers, they've actually put the bridge much further back than on the Nimitz's, specifically to make the air group command and control task a lot easier. So I think you might see twin island carriers a bit more, but that's about it for them. Submarines, well, their weapon has always been stealth, and as sonar and other systems improve, they're just going to get stealthier and stealthier. The Russians did have a line on deep diving subs. We might see that go forward a bit, but essentially the role of submarines as hunter-killers and strategic nuclear weapons platforms, again, I don't think is going to change. You probably will see faster and faster torpedoes along the lines of the Spearfish, and as I say, you might see deeper diving subs as well to explore and exploit more thermal layers and the noise dampening effects of deep water. The regular surface combatants, I think, are going to be where you're going to see the most change. They're definitely becoming a lot stealthier already. You have a look at the some of the littoral combat ships, the Type 45 destroyers, a lot of smaller French and Russian ships that are coming out recently. Everyone's heading towards a sort of semi-stealth platform for their surface combatants. You're probably going to see longer range and more anti-ballistic property surface-to-air missiles. And you're also going to see a transition possibly away from chemically propelled guns and towards things like rail guns and lasers, although probably not for a good few years yet. Maybe not this coming generation of ships, maybe the one after that. The one big question that stands out from all of that is once you have all these sort of rail guns and lasers and other high-powered weapons on surface ships, whether or not that's going to affect the viability of aircraft as the main strike power of most ships, or whether it might transition back towards a sort of Russian model of big sea-skimming, possibly stealth, supersonic or hypersonic cruise missiles. But that's really too far out to call. Dog of the Desert basically asks, can you walk us up the various levels of a pagoda mask on an actual Japanese battleship and tell us what happened on each level? Yeah, sure. I will probably have to dedicate a special episode to that. No promises about whether or not I release it at Christmas time with a slightly horrible rendition of me singing "Oh Pagoda Tree, Oh Pagoda Tree." There you go. Anyway. Alfredo Sierra asks, if Japan had noticed how powerful aircraft carriers were, why didn't they stop wasting money and resources building the Yamato class when you could possibly build multiple carriers, since in the end the giant steel beast did mostly nothing but sit in port and get sunk? Well, the simple answer to that is that World War II gives a slightly tilted picture of naval planning in the 1930s. Basically, every major naval power in the 1930s did have a place for aircraft carriers. However, realistically, right up pretty much until the Second World War broke out, aircraft carrier striking power just wasn't that good. Certainly not enough to tip the balance of a naval war. So going into the Second World War, the British were still thinking, along with most people, along the lines of using aircraft to harass, damage and slow down the enemy battle line to make it easier for the battleships to actually finish them off. And when you look at the type of aircraft even the American and Japanese carriers were fielding in 1939, you can see where everyone was coming from that, because they were slow, underpowered, not particularly capable aircraft, and their striking power in kind of the results we see in the Pacific War actually came about from a whole generation of aircraft that were introduced in late 1939 and early 1940. Things like, obviously, initially the Zero and the Dauntless and things like this. I mean, in some of the earlier battles of the Pacific War, you saw what were effectively pre-1940 aircraft like the devastated torpedo bomber, and they just got shot down in massive numbers, which kind of shows what the 1930s would have been like. And the Yamatos, getting back to your original question, were planned in the late 1930s when aircraft basically just weren't the deciding factor they were going to be. I mean, all credit to the Japanese, they did actually figure it out once they got round to Shinano, albeit it was far too late by then. Admiral Viridian Toast asks a question that effectively amounts to why were some US anti-aircraft mounts the 40 and 20mm guns, and why were others 5-inch mounts? Why did things like the Enterprise carry 5-inch and then later Bofors? So, yeah, let's see about that. The answer is effectively range. So a 5-inch gun can range out a lot further than a 40mm or a 20mm cannon, but obviously its rate of fire is less, and because they're bigger guns, you can fit fewer of them. So you would use these larger shells to try and take out, if you're lucky, a few planes, fill the sky with shrapnel, break up the attacks coming in, and then your 40 and 20mm would take on the aircraft as they got close enough to release their payloads, and obviously the 5-inch would still be blazing away, but both sets of guns had their own roles. If you had a ship that just had a few more 5-inch, then yeah, it might break up the attacks coming in, but once the attacks got in close, you not really got much of a chance of stopping anything serious. Whereas if you had a ship that was just covered in 40 and 20mm AA, the enemy could mass fairly close to your ship, but outside of your AA's effective range, and then just come in one massive strike, which even your huge amounts of small caliber firearms weren't going to be able to stop. GTA 5 Tryhard Boss asks me to do USS Hornet CV8, USS Yorktown CV5, and USS Enterprise CV6. Well, you'll be glad to know we did a special on the Enterprise CV6, and we also did a general guide to the Yorktown class carriers, including the Yorktown, link hopefully appearing somewhere on the screen at the moment. As for the Hornet, well, I guess we can put it on the list to have a look at it later. Commodore Ahassan says, 2 questions. 1, what piqued your interest in warships and naval history? And 2, in terms of the videos you make, is there a specific era of naval warfare you adhere to? To answer your first question, and I had to think about this for a little while, but I think probably the thing that triggered my interest in warships and naval history the most would have been combined a history book I read when I was very young about Lord Nelson and what he did, and that led on to me reading about Francis Drake, and I quite like the idea of sort of these sort of semi-larger-than-life heroes leading fleets into battle in an era where sort of one person could actually make a difference to the outcome of a war. And based on that interest, my grandmother took me down to Portsmouth for the first time when I was 6 or 7, where I got to see obviously HMS Victory, HMS Warrior, the as then under conservation Mary Rose, and the various ships of the current Royal Navy out in the Portsmouth Harbour. And yeah, pretty much I was hooked from then on, and just kind of gradually built up my knowledge and devoured more and more books and visits to various museums and ships ever since. Now, to answer your second question, no, I don't have a specific era. I try to avoid current and near current ships mainly just because that tends to also involve talking about the politics of the current era, especially when you talk about what those ships have done in their operational careers, and I really just want to avoid that scenario. And also, albeit that I know a fair bit about most modern warships' capabilities, some of those capabilities are obviously still classified, so any video of that nature is always going to be incomplete, whereas with older ships, not so much. But on a related note, once you start dropping back past sort of the mid 1800s, records on specific ships and specific ship classes, if indeed classes for a lot of ships types even exist at that point, tend to get sketchier and sketchier. So again, the amount that you can put into a video and be accurate starts to decrease. So the main focus of the channel is probably sort of from the first ironclads through to sort of maybe the 1950s, 1960s, concentrating obviously in World War One, World War Two, which is what most people know and request. But I will quite happily go a little bit further forward than that and much further back, as long as people appreciate that. If I'm sort of talking about Elizabethan galleon or something like that, we're talking in more generalist terms, unless it's a ship that we happen to have an awful lot of information for, thanks to those unique historical accidents where you have full surviving documents coming down for specific ships and not others. Field Marshal Akajima has a suggestion for a video type series, which I will address separately in another video. But his main question is, why was the Battle of the Atlantic mostly American and British versus Germans only? Why didn't the French or Italians get involved in the Battle of the Atlantic significantly? Well, for the French, it was basically down to the fact that the Battle of the Atlantic had barely gotten going by the time France, as a nation, was pretty much done with the war. In the early events of the war, like the Hunt for the Graf Spee, you did actually have French ships, including Dunkirk and Strasbourg, getting involved in the Hunt for the Graf Spee, so they were involved in that aspect of the Battle of the Atlantic. But as I say, by the time the U-boat campaign really hit off, France had surrendered, and so their navy obviously wasn't going to take part outside of a few Free French units. As for the Italians, most of their ships were designed with Mediterranean operations in mind, which meant that their range was somewhat limited. So breaking out into the Atlantic probably wasn't going to be a very good idea. Running out of fuel is a little bit of a problem. But also, the Italian fleet wasn't that numerous. They needed all the ships they could just to try and contest the Mediterranean. And also to get into the Atlantic meant you have to go through the Straits of Gibraltar, and the British, having their one of their nice naval bases there, were pretty determined that the Italians were never going to get through the Straits of Gibraltar, and since it's insanely easy to defend and insanely easy to mine, the Italians weren't stupid enough to try. Stephen Bond asks, any chance for episodes on the Royal Navy's armoured cruisers prior to the First World War, or the Austro-Hungarian or French battlecruiser proposals, or the Italian Francesco Caracciolio class? Yeah, as with all videos, it's basically a case of name a class, stick it in the comments of a video, and hopefully I will be able to pick that up and add it to the list. Alex Ashford asks, if HMS Vanguard had come up against the Bismarck, well, I guess presuming the Bismarck had survived long enough, which one would be the winner in your opinion? Well, I'm just going to say straight up, I think the Vanguard is going to take that pretty no contest. Bismarck is possibly being a little bit unfair to it, being sunk in 1941. It obviously never received late war upgrades, although I guess we can look at Tirpitz and see what kind of extra equipment Tirpitz got over Bismarck to see how a late war Bismarck might look. But honestly, Vanguard was a modified Lion class hull. It's much more heavily protected than Bismarck. It's got much more advanced radar, much more advanced fire control. It's faster. It's all round a better ship, with possibly the sole exception of its main guns. So obviously each side have 8 15-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, pair super firing forward, pair super firing aft. And before I get into too much of a 5-minute guide, the German guns are obviously more modern guns, but the British 15-inch 42 was a very, very good gun. So firepower is kind of neither here nor there. but, and this is going to cause probably a little bit of controversy in the comments, the Vanguard appears to be, from my research, the only ship that could have carried the 15-inch supercharges. Now, this is a little bit of an interesting issue, which is basically someone worked out how much extra powder charge you could put in to the 15-inch 42 gun and basically fire the shell with a lot more power, a lot more speed, a lot more range. They were only ever issued in practice to the coastal batteries on the south coast of England, but according to D.K. Brown, who, as I've mentioned in a previous video, was a Royal Navy architect, and due to when he started work, actually, believe it or not, worked during the time that Vanguard was just about completing, and therefore had access both to the ship itself and to all of its design documents. He states, contrary to some other historians' opinions, that not only was the Vanguard designed with to be able to fire the superchargers, but he also says that the specialized reinforced mountings on the 15-inch guns were actually fitted, so Vanguard was perfectly capable of using these superchargers. It's just that being completed post-war, she was never issued with them because of the problems with barrel wear, etc., that firing sort of an overpowered shell would cause, and in peacetime there was therefore no need to. So my personal belief is that if Vanguard had been somehow finished early and taken into combat against a Bismarck-class vessel, in the actual war period, it would have been issued with superchargers, and that would have given its guns a significant firepower advantage to go along with its general overall superior layout, and so that would have been that for that particular fight. In a related question, 85's Reviews and More says, if you're able to design the third Bismarck, what would you call it? Well, the Germans had pretty much used up all of the good names that they had of the sort of the more well-known naval heroes that from the First World War, things like von Hipper and Scheer, and obviously they'd gone back to statesmen with Bismarck, Tirpitz being an admiral, etc. So those were already done and taken. Probably wouldn't have gone down very well with the Nazi Party at the time, but me personally, given that all those other names were taken, if I had to pick, I would probably either go with just bringing back Graf Spee, because that ship lasted not too long, or possibly taking a bit off that theme, naming it after Captain Langsdorff, because he really doesn't get enough credit for what he did. And for those of you not keeping up with that particular reference, he was the captain of the Graf Spee at the Battle of the River Plate, and was pretty much one of the most honourable, if not the most honourable, officers in the entire Kriegsmarine. So, Santiago Trujillo Tobon, I think, please forgive me if I got that wrong, he asks a three-part question, and two of those questions will require a lot of extensive background research by me, so I will get to those in a future episode. But the third part of his question, he says, Hearts of Oak or Der Mächtigste König im Luftrevier, and please, anyone who speaks German, don't murder me for that, but I wasn't particularly good at high school German. Well, in answer to that question, I must say, actually, I like both. I'm gonna have to go with Hearts of Oak, and believe, whether you want to believe me or not, that's not just because I happen to be British. It's just because the pace of Hearts of Oak is just that little bit slower. So it sounds a bit more like a kind of marching tune, to my ear at least. The German one, although it's a very nice song, and having read the English lyrics as well, it's quite a rousing song. It's just a little bit too fast. It sounds a little bit more like a dance, or maybe a quick step or something like that. It had me grinning and kind of wanting to bounce around a bit while I was listening to it. Just because it seems fairly cheery and upbeat. But I'm guessing that's probably not what the effect they were going for. Correct me if I'm wrong. Who knows? Eat This VR6 says, please redo the Warspite video with voiceover, because that's one of the ones I did with text-to-speech. Easily the best video about the ship. brackets, which is a crime in itself, close brackets. Yeah, I do agree. There is a surprising lack of Warspite videos out there, given the ship that it was. And you know what? Yeah, okay, fine. I've got most of next week off of work anyway. I will redo the Warspite video at some point next week and stick it up, probably on the Wednesday with Wednesday's special. Donald Palmrose asks, what is the deal with the lattice masts? The US Navy adopted them for some strange reason, and I know strong storms could collapse them, so why wasn't that anticipated, and when did the US Navy switch to the traditional mast superstructure arrangement? So the lattice mast was adopted for two primary reasons. One being that it was felt that its structure, being a little bit more flexible, would absorb the minor vibrations involved with running a ship at high speed and all the other mechanics that were beginning to take over ships of the time, which would then obviously stabilize the fire control equipment and help give a more steady bearing and range. And secondly, it was to do with a fear of the mast being hit, the idea being that a lattice mast would be able to have a shell go through it, hopefully without detonating, and even if it did, taking out a few of the supports on a lattice mast wouldn't collapse the whole thing, whereas obviously with a traditional single pole mast, a shell going through it, A, is probably going to detonate, and B, even if it doesn't, it's probably going to take out enough of the mast just to collapse the whole thing down. So yeah, it was a kind of redundancy in battle arrangement. What did them in was, obviously, as you mentioned, they weren't the strongest of things, as it turns out, and strong winds, even ships rolling quite violently, could bend or break them. And as rangefinder equipment got bigger and heavier, as gun caliber and range got larger and larger, they just weren't strong enough to take the equipment that was required of them, and so the US Navy switched back to the traditional, well, at that time, what was then had become the traditional tripod mast and superstructure arrangement at some point in the mid 1920s. You look at some of the designs for the Lexingtons and the South Dakotas still retained lattice masts. Some of the later sketches and drawings, etc., that prepared showed tripods, and also with the sort of the mid to late 1920s, the refits of the early standard class, etc. That's when they lost their lattice masts and went over to tripods. So there you go. Commando Dude asks, I was wondering why after the introduction of the super dreadnoughts you see relatively few ships being launched with less than 14-inch guns but more than 8-inch guns. What was the thinking of naval architects at the time that made them exclude designs of intermediary gun types between battleships and heavy cruisers, like the Scharnhorst class? So basically what it came down to was that sort of the 8-inch gun, give or take a few fractions of an inch, was about the biggest that you could get at the time that could maintain a relatively steady and high rate of fire, at least a high rate of fire as far as naval artillery was concerned. And you started to see quite a significant drop off in the rate of fire once you started getting bigger guns. So say the British 9.2-inch gun of World War One, and I think a couple of American cruisers at least were designed with a 10-inch gun, and their rate of fire dropped right down quite sharply just because of the increase in size and weight of the shell and charge to something more approaching battleship gun reload times. And that then flips around to, well, if you've got the rate of fire of a battleship, but your gun is substantially smaller than the main guns of a battleship, you're not hitting as hard and you're not putting out any more volume of fire, so there's no real advantage to it. And of course, with cruisers, where you tend to need a lot more of them, you're trying to keep the costs down. Even if you're Britain or America at the time, you still want to keep your costs down to get more hulls out. And if you're putting a 9.2-inch or 10-inch or 11-inch armament, that means you're going to have to increase the size and displacement of the ship quite significantly, which pushes costs up, especially when the rule of thumb was to try and armour a ship with a reasonable zone of immunity against its own guns. So that's why you see quite the jump from sort of your 8-inch gun treaty cruisers up to sort of 12-inch gun cruiser killers like the Alaskas, the B-65s, the Kronstadt, Stalingrads, etc. They almost double or more in displacement. And of course, although those guns will be a lot more capable of dealing damage to enemy cruisers, well, your 8-inch shells were probably going to do that anyway. And whether you've got a sort of a 10, 11-inch shell or something like that, by the time you're onto the super dreadnoughts and they're flinging 13.5, 14, 15, 16-inch shells around, those ships being armored against those shells are not especially going to be any more threatened by your shells at your intermediate calibers than they are by 8-inch shells. So you might as well go with the higher rate of fire that you get out of the 8-inch gun. And therefore, obviously, the smaller ship and the more ships you can get. Because if you take an intermediate class ship, the enemy's probably going to put a couple of 8-inch ships in the water in exchange, and 2 versus 1 is probably not going to work out that well. Best to Destroy Minecrafter 2016 says, which ship would you want to command, the USS Iowa or the HMS Hood? Well, if you're talking about historically, USS Iowa is still physically with us. HMS Hood is not. It's in quite a few bits at the bottom of the Denmark Strait. So, in the immortal words of that ancient wise creature Sid,
no thanks, I choose life.
Which, as you might guess, involves going with USS Iowa. That said, if Hood had survived the battle, or just not been in the battle, and had gotten its hypothetical 1941 refit, oh, hell yeah, sign me up for commanding that thing. Veni Vidi Vici says, I actually look forward to these more than the regular videos. Also Patreon. Well, I'm glad the channel's offering something for everyone, and as long as people are enjoying the output, then I don't mind if you have a particular favourite or not. As far as Patreon goes, I suppose I could. Just a bit difficult for me to wrap my head around the idea of people wanting to give me money for this, but YouTube certainly doesn't want to, but there you go. I guess I could set one up. I have to think about what the rewards would actually be. Suggestions and comments in the comments below. Yeah, who knows? Yes, yeah. Well, that, yes. Shutting up now. Field Marshal Akajima again asks, what if Yamato, Iowa, Bismarck, King George V, Roma, and Dunkirk all sailed together and were attacked the same way the Yamato was attacked the day she was sunk? Would they survive? Who'd get sunk? And very big what if question, do you play Naval Craft? Well, I don't know if there is a game called Naval Craft. I did used to play the old game Navy Field back in the day, before it got completely insane. Years and years and years ago. I was quite the beast with the manual fire control. But yeah, that game was both hilariously well historically researched and hilariously badly historically researched. They had every single gun system and ship class that virtually any of the World War I and World War II navies ever produced, which was really fun and interesting. But the way you could configure your ship was just so ridiculously ahistorical. I think at one point I had a Lion class up to about 67 knots, no belt armor, and enough deck armor to. It was about 10 inches of deck armor or something stupid like that. But yeah, anyway. So yes, Naval Craft no, Navy Craft Field used to. And as for the main point of your question about this hypothetical mixed battle group, I think collectively they definitely would survive the sort of 300, nearly 400 aircraft the Americans threw at the Yamato. I don't think they'd survive the total American attack, because obviously the Americans could stop throwing aircraft at the Yamato. Once the Yamato sunk, the Americans did have a lot more aircraft in reserve, and of course the ones that had attacked first could go back and rearm and refuel, because not a lot were shot down. So I don't think, outside of the formation just turning tail and legging it, that they would survive, and if they did, they would just be by getting out of range overnight. I suppose if they're all going down to try and do Operation Tango, then yeah, a bunch of them might actually survive to get there. Because at that point, I think it probably got maybe a day or two sailing, and night attacks weren't really a thing unless you were the Enterprise. So yeah, some of them might have made it. As for who'd get sunk, etc., well, let's have a look. Dunkirk Yeah, Dunkirk's going down pretty quickly. It's the smallest of the ships. It's not especially well protected, either with AA batteries or its torpedo defense system. Um, so yeah, that's going to get sniped off pretty quickly. Roma, again, not the world's best AA system. If the torpedo defense system works as advertised, then it's got a reasonable chance, but we know historically that system, as built in the Roma class, had a number of flaws, mainly in the implementation, not necessarily the design, so I don't think the Roma's going to hold up very long. Um, King George V class, decent AA, not the best, but reasonable. And yeah, if they've given the blasted thing tracer rounds, unlike the Prince of Wales, it might actually deter some attack. Its torpedo defense system in general is pretty good. Prince of Wales did luck out quite badly with that stern shot that it received. But although King George V would last longer than Roman Dunkirk, I don't really see it surviving unless it's a sort of a 1945 King George V. Bismarck, it has a lot of AA, but again, it got attacked by a bunch of swordfish and didn't manage to take any of them down. So lots of AA doesn't necessarily mean good AA. However, as we saw when the swordfish actually did attack, its torpedo defense system was actually pretty good, as long as you didn't get a lucky shot on the stern and in its case jam its rudder. So albeit that I can't see Bismarck doing all that much with its AA guns, I can see it surviving a fair bit of time. Iowa has a decent, but even the Americans acknowledge it to have some flaws in its torpedo defense system. It does have flat out the best AA suite of any of the ships here, so it is going to be the hardest target. However, the blasted thing turns like a barn door. So I can see it surviving a lot of incidental attacks and coming up pretty unscathed. But if those swarms and swarms of aircraft decide, screw it, we're just going to concentrate and throw a couple of dozen torpedoes at it, I can't see it actually getting out of the way of a successful spread of torpedoes if the AA doesn't manage to take down all the incoming torpedo bombers first. That is going to be a bit of its Achilles heel, its lack of maneuverability. And Yamato, well, we know what happened with Yamato historically. Not the world's most brilliant AA, again, kind of like the Bismarck. Yeah, it did go down. But considering their collective AA firepower and the fact that you'd have to be splitting your attention between all of them, I would say that if you were talking about them all running down in Operation Tengo, I think probably any three of Iowa, Bismarck, King George V, and Yamato might actually make it at the expense of Roma, Dunkirk, and one of the others. They might actually make it to the island. If they're just going to sit there and sort of sail around until the American carriers run out of planes, no, they're not. They're not gonna come out of it alive. In those circumstances, probably Iowa would be the last to go, I think. And once again, we're rapidly running out of time with a whole load of questions unanswered. So again, if your question hasn't been answered yet, I do apologise. We will try and get to them in the next dry dock. I think I've caught up on most of the questions I missed last week, and I know if you did ask a question last week, I do still have those on the list. So to wrap up the final question for this week, Carl Dubé, I think, asks, are ruse-de-guerres, i.e. Disguises of war, banned at sea? So this is in reference to things like Q ships, armed merchant ships, etc. And so let's answer that one. Well, deceiving the enemy definitely hasn't been banned, but what they have banned is certain things that make the operation of things like raiders, disguises, and merchantmen a lot harder. Things basically surrounding abuse of national flags or flags of truce. The rules going back to the age of sail surrounding things like letters of marque, which allow civilian ships to operate as privateers, have been renounced or banned by most of the major powers. So yeah, things like Q ships and armed merchant raiders, especially ones that use disguise to sneak up on the victims, you're less likely to see now. I mean, it is a grey area in a lot of cases, but yeah, generally those kind of things are either frowned upon or banned these days. Of course, that doesn't stop you trying to disguise your actual warship, as long as you stick to within those certain rules. But yeah, it's the kind of stuff you saw in World War One and World War Two mostly now is off the cards, but not all of it. And that brings us to the end of yet another episode of the Drydock. And as I say, hopefully we'll catch up with a few more questions in the next one. And if you've asked sort of an alternate history what if type question, look out for the occasionally recurring specials on that. All right, guys, thanks very much, and I'll see you in the next video.